Okay, let's talk about guest WLAN security, right? We've all seen a guest SSID in one of our offices or to whichever hotel we go, we always see a guest SSID being broadcasted where some special users are allowed to connect who are coming from outside, and they have some special privileges and they have some special access at the back end as well, right? So most businesses usually prefer to give Wi-Fi access to the users as to guests as convenience, right? So that's pretty much what this is. Convenience to the guest visitors. I mean, if they want, they may not even give. They are just guests. But most of the vendors now, most of the businesses now prefer to give them access. Uh, give access to the guest as well. Now, guest wireless network allows internet access to the visitors, such as it could be like contractors or students or salespeople who come into their offices. The idea is to give them internet access. Okay, that is the idea for guest users. You want them to directly go onto the internet, you don't want them to do anything else, right? So many organizations understand the need that their visitors may be able to, they may want to access the internet and basically check their emails. So mostly to check emails and do some basic browsing on the internet, right? So that's pretty much why they have a unique SSID for guest. They have a unique SSID for guest mapped to a unique WLAN at the back end, right? So on top of this, they have special firewalls implemented, which actually restrict the users or the guest users, and their capabilities and probably also their bandwidth sometimes. So firewalls are in place to restrict the users users, right? The restriction could be on capability and it could also be on bandwidth. So restrictions could be on capability or bandwidth or both, right? That's what the firewalls in place will do for guest user authentication, right? So the security for a guest WLAN is much different than security provided on the corporate WLAN. So in your office, you might see two SSIDs, one for corporate, one for guest, right? Now the security on guest, okay, security on guest WLAN is different than the corporate one, right? That is absolutely true. Okay. Now the security goal for a guest WLAN is to provide guests with an easy accessible wireless portal to the internet, while at the same time restricting guest user access from the rest of the company network. Okay. So when a guest user walks into the network, and by the way, on a corporate WLAN you may have WPA2 enterprise, right? That is 802.1x running, whereas on a guest WLAN you have something else. We'll talk about that as we go in. But yeah, so I was saying that the main goal is to give them easy access to the internet. The access should be easy. Access should be easy, and that is access to the internet easy, but stop them from accessing the company network, right? That is what you want. You don't want them to be lingering around in the company network. You want them to give them a different access where they can directly go onto the internet, right? So there are like 4 or 5 different components, security components of a guest WLAN that we will discuss now, right? So there are like some components of security WLAN which we will talk now. Number 1 is the guest SSID, separate guest SSID. Okay. So multiple corporate SSIDs are broadcasted by companies APs along with the guest SSID that can be easily discovered by any guest user. So when a person walks in, he should be able to see a company guest SSID broadcasted on the AP along with the corporate WLAN that you see, right? So the guest SSID is normally an open network on layer 2, okay, that has no WPA2 encryption security. So on a guest SSID, on layer 2, where we have WPA2 enterprise running for corporates, layer 2 is open for guests. Okay, there is nothing on layer 2. Now they basically have something on layer 3, which I will talk about as we move along, but layer 2 there is absolutely no SSID on the guest SSID. There's no authentication on layer 2 for them. Okay, it's an open platform on layer 2. Now the next is the guest VLAN. Right, now guest traffic is usually segmented from corporate user traffic in a unique VLAN tied to a unique guest subnet. So a different subnet and a different VLAN, a unique VLAN and unique subnet is mapped to the SSID. Correct? Right? Now this guest traffic is often also routed to a demilitarized zone, that is DMZ. Now this is important because, let me write this down first. Guest traffic is usually routed to a DMZ zone, that is demilitarized zone. Now if you work with Cisco, you probably know the concept of auto anchor or anchor solution, right, where the guest traffic is routed separately onto a different controller altogether in a DMZ, which has absolutely segregation from the corporate network. There is absolutely no connection from the corporate network. So guest traffic, when comes on to the AP or a controller, it is directly routed to the different controller or a different DMZ, from where it is taken onto the internet, right? So it's kind of like segregating the traffic in the best possible way. Almost all vendors have a different solution for this, but the concept of guest traffic being routed to a DMZ remains the same for every vendor. Okay. Now firewall policy is the third one. Now, so since we know that the users are supposed to be restricted, so guest WLAN firewall policies tend to be very restrictive. As I said, the guest firewall policies typically allow only DSCP and DNS, but restricts access to the private networks. Okay, now very restrictive firewall policies, because you've got to make sure that they have absolutely no access to the corporate network, right? Restrictive firewall policies, but DSCP and DNS are allowed. Okay, also they are not allowed to access the private networks. I'll tell you why. Like 10.0.0.8/8, or let's say another one, 172. Private networks like 172.16.0.0/12, and could be 192.168 also, 192.168.0.0/16. All these kind of private networks are not allowed to access by the guest users, because usually the corporate network servers or the resources usually reside on the private IP addresses, right? So that's pretty much why they don't want them to access these private networks also. So they cannot afford any sort of a glitch or a breach there, because imagine a guest user coming in and getting access to your private servers. That's something which you don't want to do, right? So that's why the policy states in a way, works in a way, whereas the users are directly taken to the internet gateway away from the corporate network. That's the goal about it, right? So the next thing is captive portal. Security component is captive web portal or captive portal, right? Now guest users must normally log into the captive portal page before they can get onto the internet. So right, so they have to log into this captive portal before they can go onto the internet. Now captive portal solution effectively turns a web browser into an authentication device. Okay, it turns a web browser into an authentication device. Correct? To authenticate, a user must launch a web browser. Of course, he has to open Google Chrome or the Firefox or Internet Explorer. after the browser is launched, the user attempts to go onto a website, right? Could be google.com, could be yahoo.com, could be any cwnp.com, right? And no matter what web page the user attempts to browse, the user is redirected to a logon prompt. Okay, now whenever a user enters www.google.com, for example, or any other web page, the user is redirected to a logon prompt where he has to enter is like a different page where he has to do, let's say, username or a password entry, or could be anything. Different sorts of authentication mechanisms are also there, right? That's what really happens when a user tries to log in, and then he has to enter the username and the password to get onto the network and browse the internet, right? Now that is just a small part of captive portal. We'll discuss this in a little bit more detail in the next video though. Okay, now the fifth component is the guest management solution. Okay, now most guest WLANs require a guest user to authenticate via credentials, as I said, using the captive portal. Therefore, a database of user credentials must be created, right? If you're expecting around 100 guests coming, you've got to make a database for 100 username and the password, right? Therefore, so the thing is that unlike a pre-existing Active Directory database, a guest user database cannot be created. It needs to be created on the fly. I mean, you cannot assume that which guest will come to your office, right? So you cannot create a database beforehand. So it has to be created right on the fly. Okay, so the database for guest need to be created on the fly. A pre-existing AD cannot be used. AD database cannot be used. Make sense? Okay, so usually when a guest user enters the office, you ask for the details, like you collect the username, name of the person, and then you create a user, and that's pretty much how the database is created on the fly, right? So someone has to be in charge of managing the database and creating the guest user database entries. Somebody at the reception maybe, because the IT guys are too busy. IT guys won't be able to create a database or maintain a database for guest users. So usually the person who greets them at the door, or usually the person or the receptionist will basically be responsible to create this database for the guest networks who are walking in, right? So most of the vendors nowadays, they offer a guest management solution which are simple admin accounts onto a Radius server or some other type of database servers as well. So usually they just get an admin account to create the guest database on the Radius server. It's a very simple account that they have to create. You must have heard something called a lobby admin. That's exactly what it is. Okay, so guys who are not supposed to check any other database, they just get an access or the right to create this guest database by using an admin account on the Radius server, also known as the lobby admin sometimes. So different vendors use it differently. Some use it like a lobby admin. Okay, this is exactly what it is. They just enter and create a username and the password, and they save it, and that's pretty much what is handed over to the guest that walks in also, right? So in the next video we'll talk about what captive portal is, not in too much detail, because in the fundamentals course that's pretty much what you need, what I'm going to cover. But yeah, so just have an idea as to what guest authentication is and what a captive portal looks like and what options we have with that. But yeah, so far this was good enough for you to understand what a guest SSID is and a guest security WLAN looks like, right? So we'll see you in the next video now.